I'm going to be talking a bit about the blank slate, or the temptation to build authoritarian cities. In June 2021, the Egyptian president al-Sisi announced he would be building New Cairo, a new capital for Egypt. In July 2022, Indonesia likewise announced a new capital city, Nusantara. The most famous of the recent projects is the 2019 announcement of Saudi Arabia's trillion-dollar NEOM project. For centuries, there's been this temptation of, we'll build a new city, we'll build it on a blank slate, and we will get it right. As Curtis discussed, the incredible success of a small number of new cities in recent decades has really given rocket fuel to this idea. You can see that Shenzhen's GDP per capita increased exponentially from only $122 in 1980 to $30,000 in 2020. And this idea is as old as civilization itself. Of course, Constantine, the Roman emperor, in 330 AD famously relocated the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople. And even after Rome was destroyed by the Ostrogoths, Constantinople continued to thrive for another 1,000 years, preserving Eastern Roman civilization. The governments, the leaders of today, say that by building this blank slate, we can manage climate change, we can build new, green, car-free infrastructure from scratch. We can solve the threat of overpopulation. We can create economic growth in underdeveloped areas. But outside of anecdotes and success stories, there could be a darker underlying streak of authoritarianism that runs through the history of these projects. So are master plan cities utopian blank slate panaceas that cure all social problems in one fell swoops? Or are they, on the other hand, the dreams of deranged authoritarians and tyrants? Adolf Hitler famously planned on building his own master plan city, Germania. He was going to highlight the scientific advances of the Aryan races, and it would showcase the racial superiority of Germans over all other people who could not build cities like this. Alexander the Great, when he conquered the Persian Empire and eradicated multiple nations and civilizations, ordered the construction of multiple cities called Alexandria, each named after him. The most famous would be in Egypt, to commemorate his glory. Chinggis Khan, or Genghis Khan, and his son Otoge Khan enslaved tens of thousands of Chinese peasants, took them to the wastelands of Mongolia, and in the middle of nowhere, with nothing around, built Karakorum, a new capital for the Mongol Empire, from scratch. Because this city was in the steppe, as soon as the Mongol Empire collapsed, all the peasants who had been forced to live there died of starvation and famine, and the city was abandoned. Peter the Great came to power in 17th century Russia and wanted to rapidly modernize Russia so that it would be on par with the European countries. And he faced resistance from reactionaries. So he created St. Petersburg and relocated the capital from Moscow, where he reformed Russian society at a huge human cost. Tyrants have always sought to build new cities. They believe that the blank slate offered by new cities creates an environment where they can control, tame, and manipulate the human spirit. This is perhaps most exemplified by renowned Swiss-French architect Charles Le Corbusier, who had planned to build a new city where all people would live in supersized mega complexes, where all social movements could be tracked, and where all resources could be controlled. And in his utopian society, all poverty and all social ills would be eliminated this. However, to make an omelet, you must break some eggs. Here is a map of downtown Paris. That red star, that's where Notre Dame Cathedral is located. All of this area in red was slated for demolition. What is in this area? Well, there's the traditional Latin Quarter, where there have been taverns operating nonstop for 1,000 years. There's the famous Hôtel de Ville, where the French revolutionaries guillotined many of the political opponents and rebuilt France. There is the Cluny Monastery, with some of Rome's oldest ancient baths buried deep underneath the cobblestone. All of these priceless historical monuments would have been completely bulldozed to make way for Le Corbusier's new cities. In their place, a new skyscraper, a perfect, scientifically designed skyscraper that would provide everything a human being needed: a view, public parks, stores, workplaces, known as Cartesian skyscrapers, were to be built. Here is what the Paris skyline would look like today if Le Corbusier's plan had been accomplished. This is Notre Dame Cathedral, and in the back, you don't see the beautiful vistas of Paris that attract tourists today that the city's for, but you see an urban hellscape. Do you think this is far-fetched? Come on, they would have never done this. Well, think again. Look at the Eiffel Tower. In the background, you'll actually notice a row of skyscrapers. And lo and behold, in 1971, a few blocks outside of Paris would be redeveloped into La Défense. Although it kind of looks modern and cool, there's no trees, there's no alleyways, it's an urban heat island, it's an ecological nightmare. And the French immediately realized that they'd made a huge mistake. And luckily, they stopped building these new massive centrally planned developments. Le Corbusier drew up plans to raise all historical buildings in Paris and replace them with modern skyscrapers. He knew his plan would receive traction. He understood that individual government officials would empathize with his plans. Plato, the father of Western philosophy, wanted to create new cities where the state would decide who marries who has children, and which children live and die. This city was to be governed by philosopher kings who would rule using science and reason. The Le Corbusier idea is very ancient, and it transcends Western civilization. The ancient Chinese philosopher Shan Yang in the 4th century BC came up with a political philosophy called legalism. Everything in society would be standardized and made legible to rulers. Even medieval Islam independently discovered the same project. The Islamic scholar Al-Ghazali came up with a scheme whereby all private wealth would be confiscated by the Seljuk Sultan. It would then be scientifically reallocated by the state in conformity with Islamic law. Marx would later on cite Al-Ghazali as a proto-socialist. The desire to control societies by building cities is best exemplified by the Shimizu megacity pyramid. The Shimizu Corporation in 1982 was commissioned by the government of Japan to solve Tokyo's social problems. So they suggested building a massive 2-kilometer high pyramid, and a single building would hold 1 million people. Not to be outdone, their rivals, the Tassei Corporation, proposed almost identical structure a year later, except that their structure wouldn't be 2, but would be 2.5 kilometers tall. Of course, this was never built. Of course, this was madness. Here is the proposed Exceed 4000 of Tokyo, and there is the tallest building in the world today, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. Looking at projects like this, we cannot help but think of the line, which I'm sure many of you have seen in the news, which was proposed by the Saudi government in 2021. The results of the desire to urbanize people and to control people have been disastrous. From 1917 to 1933, the Soviets took what were seen as wild Eastern nomadic people and forced them into cities in a process known as de-Kazakization. 500,000 people would be slaughtered because they refused to relocate. And what about the people who did relocate, who listened to the government? They would be moved into dilapidated apartment blocks with modern but substandard conditions, where before they lived perhaps in poverty in the plains in a rural environment, they were moved to urban hellscapes. And what's interesting is that the genocidal policies of de-Kazakization are still having ramifications today. Why? Because it was the first genocide perpetrated by Russia against the Ukrainian people. And a lot of the tensions in between Russia and Ukraine to this day have their roots in the forced urbanization policies of the Russians. Forced urbanization policies had disastrous consequences in Ethiopia in the 1980s, when the Soviet-backed government caused a famine that would lead to 300,000 deaths. Even America, land of the free, home of the brave, had its own horrifying experiment with forced urbanization. When the Native Americans refused to conform, refused to adopt Western languages, American dressed, Protestant Christianity, they were forcefully moved into cities. in an event known as the Trail of Tears, and between 60,000 and 100,000 Native Americans would be killed. But there's another side to new cities. For every force, there is a counterforce. For every Plato, there is an Aristotle. Plato lived in a world of absolute truth, where wise philosophers, kings could see what the people could not, whereas Aristotle lived in a world of scientific uncertainty and curiosity. He instead envisioned a political system where the people could make their own choices and could decide for themselves. For every Shanyang, there is a Lao Tzu. When Shanyang said the state should control everything, Lao Tzu said the state should control nothing. The ruler of a small city once came to Lao Tzu and asked for advice on how to govern his city. Lao Tzu thought and replied, "If you want to be a great leader, you must follow the Tao. Stop trying to control. Let go of fixed plans and concepts, and the world will govern itself. The more prohibitions you have, the less virtuous people will be. The more weapons you have, the less secure people will be. The more subsidies you have, the less self-reliant people will be. Therefore, the master says, I let go of the law and people become honest. I let go of economics and people become prosperous. I let go of religion and people become serene. I let go of all desire for the common good, and the good becomes as common as grass." For every Al-Ghazali, there is an Ibn Khaldun. Where Al-Ghazali advocated for the state to manage all resources, Ibn Khaldun argued that these planned cities made people weak and decadent. He instead praised the Arabs of the Maghreb for their love of liberty and lack of planning. And he argued that if Muslims were to live in cities, they'd need to focus on building small, tightly knit religious communities and to be free from state authority. In the modern urban planning debate, the view that cities should be used to liberate rather than control humans is most exemplified by the American urbanist Jane Jacobs. And thus, in urban planning, we have a millennia-old debate where, on one hand, you have people like Jacobs who argue that cities should grow organically, chaotically, rather than be planned. And you can have new cities that are chaotic. And it's because of the imperfections of organic growth that makes cities worth living in. Cities are beautiful because of their inefficient narrow alleys, their dirty food trucks, and their non-uniform houses. New cities can sometimes be built using the Lao Tzu, Ibn Khaldun, Jane Jacobs mentality, rather than the Plato, Al-Ghazali, Le Corbusier mentality. Sometimes the best new cities are designed from the ground up to be wild gardens rather than sterile plantations. The port of Livorno was built as a planned city by the Medici banking clan in 1518 in Italy. You see, the Medicis were based out of the inland city of Florence, which was landlocked. So they bought a patch of coastal land and decided to build a deep water port from scratch. Because they were bankers, the most prominent banking clan of Renaissance Italy, they didn't care about rational planning. They didn't care about building a new society. They didn't even care about people. All they cared about was money. Livorno was the strategic port and just wanted to control it and have a nice place for their villas. So as a result, they developed a freewheeling attitude. They were not Catholic pietists. Jews and Muslims had money, so Jews and Muslims were welcomed and offered religious freedom and encouraged to do business there. And in fact, because Jews and Muslims had been kicked out of every other city, they paid a premium to do business in Livorno. Over time, Livorno streets became a decrepit, ramshackle mess of informal settlements. And many other cities at the time were redeveloped. Leonardo da Vinci was famously commissioned to develop plans to raise chunks of Milan and get rid of the urban decay. But instead, the Medicis just let the urban blighted districts rot. And over time, like when you leave a piece of bread in the fridge for too long, the rot led to growth. And a slow, gentle, centuries-long process of gentrification occurred. And now, Livorno's streets are world-renowned for their charm. In fact, the Protestant religion would not exist without Livorno. When Martin Luther fled the Papal Inquisition, he spent a year hiding in the city. They took in all outcasts and pirates and weirdos, and he was no exception. Not all new cities are built by governments, but sometimes cities built by the private sector can be just as authoritarian as those built by literal dictators, or can be just as free as those built by slum dwellers. Gurgaon, Cyber City, is a private town built by the Indian real estate firm DLF in 1988. 100,000 people live there. It's the second per highest capita income city in India, home to big companies like Oracle, Google, Microsoft. Fordlandia was a company town built by Henry Ford in the Brazilian jungle. In many ways, it's the worst of these cities. He hoped to control every aspect of his workers' lives, down to their sex lives and their diet. And ultimately, worker riots and logistical issues from building in a jungle caused the city to be abandoned. Even Walt Disney planned on building Epcot, experimental prototype community of tomorrow. However, Disney died before it could be completed, so we have no idea if it would have been a wild garden or an authoritarian hellscape, and today it's a theme park. Private real estate developers often lack the grandiose vision of the futures. Like the Medicis, they often just care about money. So sometimes private cities are less grandiose and more organic. One interesting example of a city that's beautiful, but really mundane, there's nothing particularly crazy about it, is Foster City, which is 35 kilometers outside of San Francisco. Every home has access to a boat dock, and it's called the Venice of California. For decades, it was a government-owned marsh and uninhabited, and they didn't have environmental protection back then, so that wasn't a concern. And for decades, the US Air Force was attempting to build an expansion for an airport that was going nowhere. However, dredging the marshlands was really expensive, so the government gave up and sold the plot in 1954 to Jack Foster. In 20 years, the marshy wasteland would go from mostly vacant to one of San Francisco's most in-demand suburb. And it was built in a record time from 1963 to 1971. Every single vacant plot was sold and developed. What's unique is that each home has both a road access for automobiles and a small dock for boats. And while this is common in Florida, at the time it was unique in the West Coast. So there wasn't some grandiose, we're going to solve poverty, we're going to cure hunger. It was this very simple idea. Oh, each home, a place to park your car and a place to dock your boat. Well, major corporations like the credit card company Visa established their headquarters there. Costco, IBM, Oracle all have their corporate headquarters, so it has this economic success story. And the simple principle that every house should have a boat was all it took to build one of the nicest suburbs in the Bay Area. Sometimes, as new cities become cities, they might start off as authoritarian, but sometimes they become chaotic and they reach their peak apogee as how good they are when they're chaotic. Shanghai in China has thousands of years of history, but most of the city was just sort of small villages until Europeans arrived in the aftermath of the Opium Wars, and the city was carved out as a treaty port. During this time, which the Chinese today call the Century of Humiliation, the Chinese were subjected to economic discrimination, massacres, and many serious human rights abuses. Shanghai would be rebuilt and destroyed anew because during the Japanese invasion and during the Chinese Civil War, the city was almost completely destroyed except for a handful of historical blocks. The anti-colonial blowback was one of the reasons why Mao came to power. Slave became master, and Mao attempted many of the same policies as the colonial overlords. So tragically, history repeated itself. The city of Shanghai became a new city a second time. Mao rethought everything the colonials had done, and Shanghai was rebuilt. Once more, Shanghai was centrally planned. Once more, the results would be disastrous. Thousands of peasants would flock to Shanghai as a result of the Great Famine and would be forced to live in so-called mega slums. After the death of Mao, China turned a new page, as Curtis discussed. It reformed, its economy boomed, and it went from a communist basket case to a capitalist superpower. Shanghai was once again reimagined for a third time, this time as a capitalistic city. A new city district, Shanghai Pudong, was built on the swampy marsh outside of Shanghai proper, and is today China's foremost financial center, home to the stock exchange. What's unique is it's hard to find cities that were pretty much destroyed and built from scratch 3 times. As far as I know, Shanghai is really one of the only cases of a city that was destroyed, rebuilt by the colonialists, destroyed, rebuilt by communists, and destroyed and rebuilt by capitalists. So it's a very unique social studies case. Its growth became increasingly organic. The city over time became dotted with alleyways and informal communities and would be replaced with what Jane Jacobs calls beautiful chaos. Reality is always complicated, with few cities being unambiguously good and few unambiguously bad. Probably the most ambiguous success story is that of Dubai. Almost the entire city was built during the 30-year period from 1980 to 2010. And although the city's become powerful, there are many serious allegations that taint the success of Dubai. It's a city of paradoxes. And when I was in Dubai, you see on the beach women wearing niqabs coexisting peacefully with women wearing bikinis. It's the strangest thing. Dubai was built by the brilliant Sheikh Mohammed Al Maktoum, a genius who has flirted with both Le Corbusier and Jane Jacobs, with both Shen Yang and Lao Tzu. He's actually published several philosophical treatises. So he's, as far as I know, he's the only literal philosopher king who's in power today. On one hand, Dubai has chaotic, unregulated districts like the gold markets, which have a vibrant ant economy where small businesses flourish. The lack of serious urban planning and regulation means that there's no sense of micromanagement, and there's many very organic, vibrant spaces. On the other hand, Dubai is home to large special economic zones that are sort of micro-planned cities within cities. And many are literally called cities, like Dubai Internet City. Unsurprisingly, there's many human rights problems. The worst is that the cities were partially built with slave labor, although since 2010, a lot of the practices have improved, but there's still huge problems. So it's hard to determine if Dubai is a true new city. It would probably be an edge case and is probably not make it on the map. I'd need to check, or one that grew chaotically. But the only thing that's clear is that it was built by philosopher kings, and it's not even clear if it was a good or a bad city. Before I end, I want to recommend a book called A History of Future Cities by Daniel Brooks, where he actually goes over Dubai, St. Petersburg, Shanghai, and many of the cities that I covered here. And it's a fascinating exploration into the paradox of modernity and authoritarianism. The importance of new cities to the global economy cannot be underestimated. They're tools of geopolitical conflicts between world powers. It could be the key to help Africa weather increased population. They could answer climate change by building a green slate, literally a blank slate. Our data is revolutionary. It's the first data set to even start tackling all of the hard questions when it comes to new cities. How free are new cities? Which new cities have been successful? Which have failed? Do new cities need to be legally autonomous in order to succeed? How many new cities are there? What impact will new cities have on the future of urbanism? Are new cities economically efficient? Are they wasteful? For the first time, researchers around the world, for free, will just be able to download our data and do research to answer the many questions that I brought up in this presentation. We've proven that we can do something that for many years was called impossible by traditional academia, and we need your support to finish the project. So thank you very much.